3 wedding invitations, a secret buried for 10 years, and 3 boys bearing the exact face of the most powerful man in Silicon Valley. Ethan Wallace thought he had it all, until the past came knocking on the very day he was set to walk down the aisle. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he was the one in control of the game. "Sir, it's 4. The assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, snapping Ethan Wallace back to reality. He glanced at the gleaming platinum Rolex on his wrist, then at the Forbes magazine cover on his desk. His own face stared back at him, a cold smile plastered across it. Beneath the headline, "The Billion-Dollar Mind Behind Future Code." His fingers brushed lightly over the text, but his gaze was more pensive than usual. Today was no ordinary day. He was about to head into a meeting with the wedding planner, his wedding planner, for his marriage to Eva Bennett, the most beautiful woman on social media and nearly a decade his junior. Everything was perfect. The lavish venue, the guest list packed with investors, media, and founders from across Silicon Valley. But why did his collar feel like it was choking him? The office door swung open. Eva swept in like a luxurious breeze, silk dress, stiletto heels studded with crystals, and a smile that stylists had spent a week perfecting. "Ethan, darling, we need to go over the guest list again," she said, her voice sharp, her eyes cutting like lasers. "I thought we finalized it yesterday." Ethan rubbed the silver streaks beginning to show at his temples. "We did, but I added one more." Eva perched on the edge of his desk, tapping her meticulously manicured nails against the glass surface. "Rachel Monroe? Seriously?" He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I want her to see what she missed out on." Eva let out a soft laugh, half amused, half skeptical. "Wow, petty in an adorable way." 6 years ago, Rachel, the only woman who'd ever made Ethan consider settling down, had walked away from him. No accusations, no tears, just a sad look and a single sentence. "One day, you'll understand what real happiness is. I just hope it's not too late when you do." Back then, Ethan had smirked. She'd left him right when his company was in the middle of its most critical funding round. He'd convinced himself she lacked the patience, the vision to stick with a man on the verge of changing his life. But why did that look of hers still haunt him through the long nights? "You've never talked about her," Eva remarked, glancing at him while scrolling through photos of her wedding dress fittings on her phone. "Is there something unresolved?" Ethan gripped the handle of his leather briefcase, his gaze drifting. "Rachel said I was never present in the relationship. I was always at the office in demos, pitching. She said she felt invisible." Eva shrugged, unbothered. "I'm sure she's moved on by now." Ethan nodded but said nothing more. In his mind, he saw the day Rachel walked out of the apartment they'd once shared, small suitcase in hand, her face pale but still forcing a smile. Over the past 6 years, Ethan Wallace had gained everything. A tech empire worth billions, inspirational TED Talks about innovative thinking, over 3 million social media followers, a stunning fiancé perfect for PR, and a void no amount of success could fill. Because every time he sat alone in his lavish penthouse, Ethan remembered something small. Rachel used to bring breakfast to his workspace, sitting quietly as he typed lines of code, saying only, "Don't forget we're building another project too." "The wedding's in 3 weeks, darling," Eva said, pulling him from his memories. "We need to make sure everyone knows this is the tech wedding of the year." Ethan stood, slipping into his custom-tailored blazer, and looked in the mirror. He saw a successful, wealthy man, but his eyes searched for something else in that reflection. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, only that a simple invitation might awaken the past, and maybe things wouldn't go according to plan anymore. The iron gate let out a soft clank as Ethan Wallace pulled his car to the curb. The silver-gray Tesla Model S shut off silently, but his heart didn't. It was pounding uncomfortably, as if protesting his presence here. The small cream-colored house had a blue-painted door and baskets overflowing with vibrant flowers. It was a world apart from his. No giant screens, no code, no strategic startups. Just the scent of greenery, peace, and a space that felt so much like Rachel. He glanced at the ivory wedding invitation tucked in his jacket pocket, embossed with the words, Ethan Wallace and Eva Bennett, cordially invite. Recipient, Rachel Monroe. He'd debated for a week before keeping her name on the list. Why deliver it in person? He wasn't sure. Maybe to close the past, or to see a flicker of regret in her eyes. He pressed the doorbell. Each second stretched into eternity. A clear, familiar voice called from inside. Coming. That voice. Still the same, but warier, softer. When the door swung open, Ethan nearly stopped breathing. Rachel was just as he remembered. Those eyes, the gaze that had once waited for him through nights he'd spent more enamored with his laptop than with her. But now, she wasn't the girl who'd sat quietly on the couch waiting for him to eat dinner. She was a woman, composed, calm, and slightly taken aback at the sight of him. Ethan? She was genuinely surprised. Not quite happy, not quite sad. Just bewildered, as if unsure whether she was dreaming. He pulled the invitation from his pocket and handed it to her. Hand-delivered, he said, trying to sound casual. Rachel stared at the card, her fingers pausing over the text. A faint tremble appeared at the corner of her mouth. You're getting married? Ethan nodded. 3 weeks from now. The air grew heavy. Rachel held the invitation for a long time, as if it weighed 10 times more than it should. She flipped it over, read the words again, then looked up. Why invite me? Because we're old friends. Or we were. No, you want to prove something. Ethan didn't deny it. Part of him still wanted her to see that leaving him had been a mistake, but Rachel's eyes weren't what he'd expected. They didn't hold regret. They held concern. A small crash sounded from inside the house, then the sound of children laughing. Boys. What did I say about throwing the ball indoors? Boys, plural. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He instinctively glanced inside, but Rachel stepped forward slightly, blocking his view. You have kids? A pause. Then she nodded. 3. He flinched. 3? Who's the father? Rachel tightened her grip on the invitation, her gaze hardening. Ethan, thanks for the invite. I'll think about it, but I need to go back inside now. Before he could ask more, the door closed, but the voices from inside didn't fade. Mom, Tommy stole my game controller. Daniel says you need to study for math. Michael already finished his homework. Ethan stood frozen. 3 voices, 3 names. 3 boys. He returned to his car, his head buzzing as if it were running a million lines of buggy code. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his eyes locked on that blue door. If Rachel had left while pregnant, if those 3 kids were really... No, she'd said she'd tell him if there was anything like that, right? But for the first time in years, Ethan Wallace, CEO of a tech empire, felt fear. Not fear of losing money, not fear of losing shares, but fear of having lost something that couldn't be reprogrammed. Soft music floated through the grand hall of the Langford Hotel, where every detail, from the white satin tablecloths to the imported rose towers, was arranged with the precision of the flagship code in Future Code's projects. Ethan Wallace stood amid the flashing cameras and congratulatory murmurs, but his mind was fixated on one thing. She hasn't responded to the invitation. Rachel had remained silent. No calls, no texts. No, I'll be there. No, I can't. She'd always been like that, quiet, yet capable of shaking his heart to its core. Eva, meanwhile, was across the room, her radiant smile and suggestive touches charming the Series D investors with ease. Everything was on track, still according to plan, until the grand doors creaked open. At first, no one noticed. But then, like a reflex, the chatter hushed, replaced by a wave of surprised whispers rippling through the room. Ethan turned, and time seemed to stop. Rachel walked in. A navy blue dress hugged her gentle frame, her hair neatly pinned up, her face bare of dramatic makeup but brimming with resolve and stillness. She stood there, unafraid of the eyes upon her, but she wasn't alone. Beside Rachel were 3 boys in suits, their hair parted to one side, their faces so identical it left the crowd gaping, and so unmistakably like Ethan's that denial was impossible. The 3 children stepped forward in sync, like 3 reflections from a memory Ethan never knew he'd created. "Oh my God," Eva whispered beside him, her champagne flute slipping from her hand and shattering on the marble floor. No one bent to clean it. No one moved. Ethan couldn't move. The 3 boys stopped right in front of him and Rachel. The room fell deathly silent. Rachel took a breath, her voice soft, but resounding like a warrant. "Ethan, this is Logan, Caleb, and Owen Wallace. Your sons." No one spoke, not even Ethan. His face drained of color, as if the blood had been cut off. The well-wishes, the music, the clinking glasses, all vanished. In their place were 3 pairs of gray-blue eyes staring at him. The same eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. No way! Eva stepped back, her eyes wide, her voice trembling. "James, say something." Rachel opened her purse. She pulled out a thick envelope and placed it on the table like a verdict. Birth certificates, DNA reports, birth dates, identical, triplets. Ethan staggered. The room spun, not from shock alone, but from a strange sensation piercing through the armor of a CEO who'd once controlled hundreds of millions of dollars a day. A small voice broke through. "Dad? Dad!" It was Logan, the oldest, his gaze bold, his hand gripping his brother's tightly. Ethan doubled over, clutching the edge of a chair to keep from collapsing. "I didn't mean to ruin the wedding," Rachel said, her eyes still on him. "But if you really wanted me to see you happy, I thought I should bring everything you missed along too." Eva's arms fell limp, her eyes brimming with betrayal. But Ethan didn't hear her anymore. He only saw Logan standing tall like a little leader, Caleb curiously scanning the room, and Owen clutching a book to his chest like a shield. 3 tiny souls, 3 lives he'd never known he'd created. "Dean," Rachel said one last time, "whether you want it or not, you're a father, and maybe, for the first time in your life, you have to choose a perfect stage or 3 children waiting for their dad to claim them." Ethan said nothing. He couldn't. All those TED Talk speeches about iron will, all those pitches to hundreds of investors, no words could escape his throat now. And in that silence, Eva turned and walked out of the wedding hall without looking back. Ethan remained, facing those eyes so like his own, but the purest versions of a father he'd never learned how to be. Ethan Wallace woke at 6:14 a.m., not to an alarm, but to a dream. In it, he stood on the tech front conference stage, but when he opened his mouth, 3 children emerged from the wings, staring at him in silence, their faces blurred like corrupted code. He opened his eyes, slumping back into the sofa in his now eerily empty penthouse. The wedding photo was gone from the table. So was Eva. All that remained was an unsent invitation and a sea blue sheet of paper, crudely hand-drawn with a robot and 3 small figures beside it, scribbled with a child's handwriting. "Project for science fair. Dad, can you help us with coding the sensors?" "You're the best at it, right?" Logan had asked that last night when Ethan sat across from the 3 boys in the hotel waiting room, like an impromptu judge listening as each one pitched their science project as if it were an invitation. "They know you're not used to being a dad yet," Rachel had said afterward as she ushered the kids to the car. "But they don't need a superhero. They just need someone who listens." That afternoon, Ethan returned to the suburban house, not with an invitation this time, but with 3 science kits, a pizza box, and a quiet unease peeking out from behind his still-tied tie. Rachel opened the door. She said nothing, just smiled. She knew he'd come back, and the 3 boys were already on the floor, surrounded by circuit boards, a robot, and a plan plastered with neon sticky notes. "Where do we start?" Ethan asked, his voice not that of a multi-million-dollar CEO, but of a man learning to breathe again. Logan, the oldest, handed him a light sensor. "This part keeps messing up, probably uneven voltage." Caleb pulled a laser pointer from his pocket. "I want the robot to find light on its own, like a scorpion from that movie." Owen said nothing, just slid a stack of handwritten code toward him. Ethan sat down amid a tangle of wires, LED bulbs, and expectant eyes, not looking for a hero or an idol, just a dad. For the first time in his life, he had no PowerPoint, no 5-year roadmap, no venture advisors, just 3 kids and an unfinished robot. And he felt alive. "I used to think the world split into 2, work and family," Ethan said as Caleb pursed his lips, soldering a circuit. "Now looks like I got that wrong." "I thought you wouldn't come," Owen whispered, eyes fixed on his book. "But I still saved the hard-coding parts." Ethan laughed. That feeling, being trusted by a child for the first time, warmed his chest like the moment he'd written his first air-free line of code. Dusk fell. The robot's lights flickered on. The room erupted in cheers and shouts from the 3 boys. Rachel stood in the doorway, holding a mug of tea, silently watching. She'd never seen him smile like that, a smile without calculation, not for press photos or investors, just for the kids, who carried his blood. As Ethan left, Caleb ran after him, shoving a folded piece of paper into his hand. Dad's schedule: help Logan with wiring, Monday, play chess with Owen, Tuesday, and at the bottom, Thursday, just hang out. Ethan climbed into his car, clutching the paper, his heart pounding like it had during his first funding pitch. Not from fear of failure, but because for the first time he was learning to start something without a backup. The MRI machine hummed ominously in the stark white room. Ethan lay still, the cold light sweeping across his head like invisible warnings. He'd never been afraid, not during tense negotiations, not when Future Code's entire system crashed, not when the woman he was set to marry walked away without a word. But now, he was terrified because for the first time, he felt time slipping away. "Mr. Wallace." Dr. Roberts' voice cut through, brief and sharp, like a loss report. "The tumor's in the frontal lobe, grade 3, signs of rapid spread." Ethan stayed silent. His hand rested lightly on the table, trying not to tremble, but his knuckles turned white. "How long?" "Maybe 6 months, with aggressive treatment." "But not treatment," Ethan interrupted, his eyes fixed on the scan on the table. "Then what?" "A decision, and I need to make it today." When he left the hospital, the cold wind stung his face, and for the first time, Ethan Wallace didn't know where to go next. No meetings scheduled, no weekly plan. Only one thing was certain. He wouldn't leave this world as a CO. He'd leave as a father. That afternoon, he sat in the backyard of Rachel's house, watching the 3 boys kick a soft ball around, bickering and laughing in voices that cracked his heart with every beat. Owen read under a tree, frowning as Caleb snatched his water. Logan darted like the wind, shouting, "Pass it to me, I'm the strategist." Caleb tumbled but laughed, springing back up instantly. Ethan tracked every movement. He couldn't look away, not because of pain, but because he didn't know how many more times he'd get to see this. "I know." Rachel stepped out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes not accusing, just wet. "Claire told me, the doctor called her, because you listed me as next of kin." Ethan nodded, said nothing. His throat tightened. "They're my kids, Rachel, but you raised them. You've been their everything, and now you need to teach me too. Don't talk like you're already gone." "I'm not leaving." Ethan smiled, faintly. "I'll stay, just not the way people think." That night, after the kids were asleep, Ethan opened his laptop and created 3 new folders. To Logan, my guardian; to Caleb, my dreamer; to Owen, my mind. In them, he began writing what he hadn't had time to say, about how being a father isn't about giving instructions, but listening to unspoken questions, about how fixing mistakes in life is like debugging code; it takes patience, not running away. About the first time he realized he wasn't the center, but part of a system of 3 small hearts. He wrote until his hands ached, wrote until the screen blurred with tears. The next morning, he met Rachel at the park, carrying a thick stack of documents. "What's this?" "Future code share transfer certificates. 3 equal parts, 1 for each of them when they come of age. Ethan, not just because they're mine," he said, "but because they deserve to own their own legacy." He'd also set up scholarships, trusts, and a series of puzzles hidden in the Tech Vision system. Riddles only someone who understood the true value of success could solve. Before leaving, Ethan looked at Rachel for a long moment. "Do you think the kids are ready?" Rachel squeezed his hand, the first time in years. "That's not the right question. The right one is, are you ready to become eternal in their hearts?" Ethan didn't answer. He smiled, and for the first time that smile carried no shadow of regret. The sounds of the middle school auditorium filtered through a hazy glass layer, clapping hands, children's laughter, judges scoring. But for Ethan Wallace, the world now revolved solely around 3 kids hunched over a tiny robot, fumbling to reattach its final gear. Logan, sharp-eyed, head tilted as he checked the wiring like a true commander. Caleb, hands smudged with oil, wiping a streak of dust off the sensor with his thumb, as if cleaning a baby's face. Owen sitting quietly beside them, rereading the algorithm, his eyes shadowed from staying up all night. Ethan stood there, gripping the metal railing, forcing his legs not to tremble. The last 3 months were slipping away faster than expected. "Dad?" Logan looked up, his voice tinged with hesitation. "If the robot wins today, can you stay a little longer?" Ethan smiled, not a smile hiding something, but a warm glow at day's end. "If the robot wins, I'll stay forever in your minds, in the code you write, and in everything you've yet to create." Logan didn't fully understand, but he nodded, and when the competition began, the 3 kids moved like a perfect unit, each with their task harmonizing like a symphony. When Wallace Robotics was announced as the winner, the auditorium erupted. Caleb shouted, Owen beamed, Logan turned to Ethan and for the first time ran full speed to hug him. The first hug from a son to a father he once thought would never be there. Ethan leaned lightly into his son's shoulder, tears not falling in streams, but soaking into memory. That evening the little house buzzed, as if clinging to every precious second. Lasagna filled the air with warmth, a robot-building game unfolded, and laughter spilled over when Ethan accidentally burned a piece of bread. Rachel stood by the kitchen, quietly watching it all, capturing each moment with eyes full of gratitude, tinged with sorrow. Night fell. The moon rose high. The 3 kids were asleep. Ethan sat on the wooden bench on the porch, the breeze ruffling his hair, the light from the house casting onto his hand, where he held a brown notebook labeled, "To my kids, your dad." He opened the first page. The words trembled under the moonlight. "Don't build a world. Build a place you want to live in. Start with a home, a hug, a name, Dad." Rachel sat beside him. "They'll remember you." "No," Ethan replied softly. "They'll carry me forward." The next morning, when Rachel woke, the 3 kids were still asleep, but the bench on the porch was empty. The notebook remained open, the wind flipping to the final page. Don't program success, program love. That's the code that never fails. 10 years later. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of the 2-story wooden house, where the laughter of a man who chose to step back from the world to enter the hearts of 3 children once echoed. Logan, Caleb, and Owen Wallace, now grown. But some things never changed. On a quiet Sunday morning, the three gathered again in the attic room they'd dubbed the lab, marked by a hand-carved sign, Wallace Brothers Tech Lab, Legacy in Progress. Logan, now the youngest CEO of a medical tech startup, sifted through documents at a pace that suggested his brain was pre-programmed. Caleb, the creative genius, stood before a whiteboard scribbling a diagram for an emotional AI system. Owen, now a quantum physics PhD candidate at MIT, flipped through the pages of an old leather-bound notebook, its cover worn by time, the word "Dad" faintly etched in the corner. "Logan," Owen said, breaking the silence. "Do you remember Dad hiding those secret code snippets in the old Tech Vision software?" Logan looked up, his eyes sparking. "The Easter eggs? We haven't found them all yet." Caleb turned, smirking, "And I just found one. In the 2032 version, tucked away in the back-end commands." He typed a few lines into the computer. The screen flickered, then displayed a scrolling message. "Success without family is just numbers on a screen. Keep building what matters. Dad." For a few seconds, no one spoke. Only the breeze rustled the curtains, carrying a gentle warmth, as if he were still somewhere nearby. In a wooden drawer, Rachel, her hair now streaked with silver, carefully pulled out 3 leather-bound notebooks. She'd kept them there. Each held what Ethan had left behind: advice, lessons, intentional coding errors for his children to fix, to learn from. Logan approached his mother, sitting beside her gently. "Today's the 10-year anniversary of when Dad left." "I know." Rachel smiled, her gaze distant. "But your father never really left this place." She placed a hand over her heart. "He once said, 'People won't remember what you built, but if you build something in their hearts, you'll never disappear.'" The 3 siblings sat together, each opening their own notebook. Logan read the first page his father had written. "You're the guardian. You'll be the steady hand when everything shakes." Caleb read a passage he'd dog-eared. "Don't just imagine a different world. Dare to draw it. Start with a blank page." Owen touched a line faded by time. "If you can't understand the universe, start by understanding yourself." The legacy wasn't money. It wasn't shares. It wasn't a company. It was 3 children who could sit together, say "Dad" without pain, and feel only warmth. That afternoon, Wallace Brothers officially launched their first product line, named Ethos, an AI-driven humanities education platform, blending technology with emotion, intellect with compassion. On the launch screen, a short code snippet introduced it: // for Dad, who taught us the only code that truly matters is the one written with love. Rachel watched her children on stage, each distinct, yet their eyes, their smiles, the way they hugged Ethan. She whispered, "Do you see? You didn't lose anything. You planted, and now they've bloomed." Somewhere, the man who once thought himself a system error had become the most perfect update to a lifetime.